Mom abandoned us for her lover 6 years ago. However, she suddenly came back to scam my dad, so I caught her red-handed and called the cops, but it backfired. Badly. Hi everyone, so a little backstory before I talk about what happened. I 22F have been living with my dad 53M for 6 years, ever since my mother 48F ran away with her deadbeat boyfriend. That happened 6 years back. And since then it's just been us. It wasn't as though my parents had an unhappy marriage or anything. It just happened out of the blue, and one fine day she was just gone. She left my dad an email, and within a year they were divorced. She didn't get any alimony though because she'd been cheating for almost a year, and I guess that's the only thing she'd really been upset about. Otherwise, from what I heard, she was doing just fine. I have a couple of friends whose moms are friends with my mother, and they stayed in touch even after she eloped, so that's how I'd get to know what she was up to. My dad tried his best to protect me from all of it and would maintain that my mom wasn't a bad person, but she was just confused and had made some bad decisions even though she'd abandoned us and run away. My dad didn't want to speak ill of her until date. He doesn't. After everything she's put our family through, he still gave her a chance to redeem herself, but she's just a snake. My dad got full custody of me, mostly because she didn't want custody of me at all, which wasn't surprising at all because my dad and I always had a better relationship as compared to my mother. After the divorce, we didn't see much of her as she'd moved to the suburbs with her boyfriend to stay with his family, but I'm assuming they got kicked out after a while since they were both good for nothing. My mother had never worked a day in her life, and her boyfriend was a college dropout. For 6 years we didn't hear from her, and then last week she turned up at our door out of the blue with all her stuff and started asking my dad for forgiveness. She told us that her boyfriend, the guy she'd run away with, had been having an affair with another woman for the past 3 months, and she just found out about it. They'd fought and he'd kicked her out, so after spending 2 days in a hotel she came straight to the only man she knew would always have a soft spot for her, my dad. I wasn't impressed because I actually physically cannot stand looking at my mother after what she did to my dad. He was a shell of a man for a long time after she left, and it was me who helped him come back to life. He would go to work and everything. He'd do everything he used to do in his daily life before she left, but he'd hardly ever smile or laugh. I knew he was suffering and was clearly depressed for years after she left, but with time and a lot of therapy he's finally been getting better consistently. For the last couple of years my mother had broken my father in a way that nobody deserves to be broken, so I think it's quite reasonable for me to hate her guts. I didn't want her in the house, and even told my dad right in front of her that I didn't think we should be helping her, but my dad told me that he couldn't turn her away, especially since it was really late at night when she'd shown up and she looked at part 2, an image of helplessness with runny mascara and hair that hadn't been washed for days. She'd clearly done her homework well and knew exactly how to get my dad to feel pity for her. My poor soft-hearted dad didn't think twice before lending a helping hand to her and told her that she could live with us for as long as she needed to until she sorted out her separation from her boyfriend. I wasn't happy about it, but my dad persuaded me to let her stay with us that night. I didn't speak to her for the next 2 days, but I did try to find out about where she'd been and what she'd been up to for the past few years. Unfortunately, all my friends whose moms had been friends with my mom back in school couldn't help me because apparently that's really the last time they heard from her as well. For 6 years she kept herself away from all that was going on in her past friend circles. My mother's family wouldn't talk to me even if I tried to, so that was a dead end too. The only thing I could do was go through her phone or laptop because I could just feel that there was something wrong with her coming back out of the blue. I'd just been considering it and hadn't actually done anything, but then around the 3rd day of her stay my dad sat me down and told me that he was considering getting back with her and giving their relationship a second chance. She wasn't at home and was out getting the groceries, so I had the liberty to completely freak out when he told me that I was against it and didn't like the sound of it at all. So he tried to pacify me by saying that he wasn't getting married to her, but they just try to live like a married couple like they used to. Even that wasn't okay with me because I knew that my mother couldn't be trusted. She hadn't done anything so far, but I had a bad feeling about her return, and I insisted that she was definitely here with ulterior motives. My dad got upset when I said that and told me that he talked to me about this when I was willing to have a discussion instead of just screaming at him, and I agree I might have been a little too overbearing with how I reacted, but that conversation convinced me that I needed to go through her phone and make sure that she didn't have any agenda to be there, which I felt like she did. I couldn't do it out in the open because I didn't want my dad to get offended, so I had to sneak into her room at night. I had to plan everything meticulously so that this didn't go wrong, and because I knew she wasn't stupid enough to not have password-protected devices, I invited a friend of mine for a sleepover. She's an ethical hacker and a childhood buddy, so that didn't raise any suspicions, and I'm really lucky that she even agreed to all of this. Thankfully, my mom's a heavy sleeper, so she didn't wake up when I did, so had also given her some melatonin gummies to be on the safe side so she'd sleep through it all, and that's what happened. I just wanted to take her phone and her laptop, but when I was going through her backpack I realized that she had a hidden pocket and it had another phone inside, so I took that phone as well and then handed it over to my friend to deal with. By 2 in the morning we'd managed to find out that she was very much in touch with her alleged ex-boyfriend, whom she'd run away with, and together they were planning on scamming my dad out of a crap ton of money. My dad's a heart surgeon and my mom's boyfriend worked at the bowling Allie, at the time they abandoned us, so we could do the math. They were really playing the long game here because my mother and her boyfriend had discussed in detail how they were going to make sure that they get back together, and my dad is fully convinced that she's helpless and has nobody to turn to. Everyone knows what a solid guy my dad is, and so of course he's going to step up and take her, and then she'd build a relationship with him, get married, and use his money to fund their lifestyle. Her plan was to get my dad to transfer certain amounts of money to her throughout the year to fund her non-existent business, and she knew he'd do it because my dad's a huge advocate for women being financially independent. And had even asked if my mother wanted to work back then when they first got married, but she preferred being asked then. As soon as my mother had taken enough money from him, they take off. It was a meticulously planned con job that they were going to go through with and dupe my dad into paying for my mother and her boyfriend so they could leave these places behind. The one thing they hadn't accounted for was me still being a very active part of my dad's life. Since they'd assumed that I would move out after college, I did have plans to do that, but after my mom ran away, I decided to stay back with my dad to look after him and be there for him. He wasn't physically sick, but I knew what he'd been through, and I couldn't just leave him. My mother had even had a conversation with her boyfriend about how I had been there and almost ruined her plans with my interference, which is why they decided that they needed to win me over too if they wanted to make this work. That explained why my mom was being so nice to me all of a sudden that day. But unfortunately for her, I could see right through her BS and didn't buy even 1 second of her little act. I copied all the data from all her devices to use as evidence against her, and then put everything back in its place. I didn't sleep at all the entire night, and only when my friend left the house at 8 o'clock in the morning did I finally take a 2-hour nap. It was a Sunday, so I knew everyone would be home. Most importantly, my dad would be home. I didn't say anything to him, and as soon as we were all up, I called the cops, and within half an hour they were at our door and were dragging my mom away to the precinct. I'd already transferred the data that I'd gathered to a pen drive and handed it over to the cops who showed up. My mother was going to be detained while the cybercrime department verified whether all the data was authentic or not, and they also seized my mom's devices. It was a confusing morning for both my parents, and my mother was acting out in a frenzy and kept screaming that I was trying to frame her, but I ignored her and just spoke to the cops. My dad was trying to calm my mother down and looked just as lost and confused as he probably felt on the inside. After around half an hour, the cops finally left with my mother, who went kicking and thrashing, and I could finally tell my dad everything peacefully. Unfortunately, that's where things went very wrong for me, because instead of asking me about what had happened, my dad lost his cool with me. As soon as the cops and my mother were gone, he told me that he was going to ask my mother to leave anyway, and he'd come to his senses just after she'd asked him for $500 last evening for clothes because she claimed she had nothing, but my dad had seen the size of the duffel bag that she had brought, plus my mother and I were pretty much the same size, so she could borrow from me if she really needed clothes. $500 just for clothes seemed a bit much at the time, and when he brought it up she pretended to laugh, but it was clear to him that she was annoyed. He'd realized that she was just here for the money, and he'd also seen the second phone she'd been using in secret, so he wasn't as clueless as I thought he was. He'd put 2 and 2 already, and even though he didn't know the nitty-gritty of what she was up to, he'd known already that she wasn't the helpless woman she was pretending to be. He planned to confront her a little later today, and then asked her to leave politely because he didn't want to get the cops and involved here, but I jumped the gun and done exactly what he didn't want me to do. I tried to explain to him what my mother had been planning, but he shut it down and said that he didn't care. It wasn't my place to call the cops at all, and he needed some time away from me and this whole mess to sort himself out. It's been a couple of days and he's not pressing charges, which is fine by me, but he's also not speaking to me. He's keeping it to a minimum right now, and I know that he's upset, but I can't figure out why, because as far as I'm concerned I did him a huge favor and saved him from getting scammed, and to be fair, there was really no way for me to know that he was aware of my mother's intentions, especially after what he said to me about wanting to give their relationship a second chance. I feel like he didn't communicate with me enough, and that's why all of this happened. Ida, for calling the cops on my mother for trying to scam my dad without consulting him first. Update 1. So I went through the comments on the post and stuff, and well, I guess I wasn't being the wonderful daughter I thought I was. I should have at least asked him what he wanted to do before calling the cops, and I see that now. I felt terrible for what I did, not for my mother, but because my dad was taking this all really hard. I apologized to him this evening, and it's been 2 hours since then, but all that he said was it's fine, and then went back to reading his book. I feel awful about all of this. I don't fully understand why exactly he didn't want to report my mother to the police, but I'm sure he must have had reasons, and I had no right to interfere without making sure that he was okay with it. First, I just want him to forgive me and for things to go back to normal again like they were before my mother came back. I haven't even been able to bring myself to focus on work fully, and had to take a day off because of how bad I feel about what happened. I don't know what happened with my mother. I'm guessing she's been let off the hook since my dad isn't pressing charges, and she technically just been planning to commit a crime but hadn't actually done anything. I haven't heard back from anyone yet, but I think she's been let off with just a slap on the wrist and a fine. My dad would know what happened, but since he isn't exactly speaking to me right now, I can't find out, and even if we do start talking, I don't think my Mother will be the first thing I bring up with him anyway. Update 2. It's been a while since the cops took my mother away and 3 days since I apologized, and today my father and I finally addressed the elephant in the room. We talked about it and cleared the air between us, and I feel kinda better. I also think I sort of understand what my dad was thinking. I still am sorry about what I did by not talking to him before calling the cops. He apologized to me for getting so mad at me and then refusing to speak to me over this because he was still just trying to sort out how he was feeling about all of this. I could tell that talking about this was hard for him, but he did tell me that the day my mother returned he felt like he could go back to his old life once again, and it would be just fine, and that's why he'd said he wanted to give their relationship another shot. He was just riding the high of my mother's return, but it didn't last long, and just the day after that he spotted her talking on the phone that she used in secret, and he was forced to wake up to the reality that my mother was never here for my dad. He was very upset about it, but couldn't bring himself to let her go, and so he waited for a couple of days more. But then when she asked for a ridiculous amount of money for clothes, he put 2 and 2 together. He waited that night and was going to talk to her the next day, but I jumped the gun and took things into my own hands instead. He was very upset about that because in spite of whatever she had put us through, he still had a soft corner for her and didn't want her to get into legal trouble or worse, start to hate him, and that's what was happening because after my mother was released and got back her phone, the first thing she did was send a nephew text to my dad saying how much she hated him for what he had done since she thought that he was the one who called the cops. Then she blocked him, and that was it. He was really upset about that, and so he'd been taking it all out on me since the arrest, but he'd finally come to his senses now, and he knew that the way he had reacted made no sense. He apologized to me profusely and acknowledged that maybe therapy wasn't working out for him as well as it was in the past, and that he needed to attend his sessions more regularly than he had been because clearly he still hadn't been able to move on from my mother completely, and I don't blame him really. My parents were childhood sweethearts, and as a kid their story was the fairy tale come true for me, but of course with time I realized that my mother wasn't the person I thought she was for all those years of my childhood and well into my teenage years. My father and I hugged for a while, and he broke down crying while I let him cry it out because he'd been really strong for a very long time, and he'd earned this cry especially after what mom did just recently, so I guess it's getting better now with me and my dad. A lot of people had very harsh opinions about him, but trust me, he's not really a bad guy. This is just a part of who he is, and it's not great, but nobody's perfect and we all make mistakes. What's important is that he realized is this and owned up to it, and so did I. Neither of us are going to leave each other's side because we're all we have. Update 3. So my mother has decided to stage a comeback into our lives, but not through the traditional way that she went for the last time. This time she decided to defame my dad online and accused him of kicking her out because she refused to marry him. My dad was blocked, and so was I, so we couldn't see the post when she put it up first, and we found out almost a day later when one of my friends told me that she'd posted this. She sent me the post as well, and it was just ridiculous how hard she was trying to play the victim here and was spewing lies so openly about my father. I had half a mind to not tell him about any of this so he wouldn't feel like crap and take matters into my own hands once more, but I didn't because of what had happened the last time. My dad was an adult above 50 years of age, and I needed to be open with him instead of trying to treat him like a kid. I'd learned that already, so I went to him and showed him the screenshot of what my mother had posted. He was disappointed at first, but then he told me that he wanted to take legal action against her and sue her for this. Everyone knew that she was just trying to get sympathy out of this, which was weird because everyone knew that she was the one who had run away with her boyfriend and betrayed my dad, so him taking her in it all should have been a big deal, and anyone who knows my dad would know that he isn't the kind of guy she was making him out to be. Her Lee should have been caught within seconds of her post, but unfortunately there are a couple of jobless, spineless, and brainless bimbos that we know who are egging her on and giving her the sympathy that she so clearly needed. I asked my dad if he wanted to post the details of what she'd been planning to do online, but he said no and told me that he wanted to do this the right way, so we're looking for an attorney right now who specializes in stuff like this, and my dad's cousin is helping us out because he's an attorney too. Things aren't bad right now, but it's a public post and my dad's quite well respected in our neighborhood, so if this post gains traction then it'll be his image and reputation at stake, which we just can't risk. I'm beginning to regret even allowing that sneaky little snake to come back into our lives at all, and I actually cannot believe that she's my biological mother because there's just no way I'm related to someone like her. Even the thought of it disgusts me. Sometimes I'd honestly rather not have a mother at all than have one like her, and this might sound insensitive to people, but gosh, she really is the worst. Update for hey guys, I'm back at after like 2 months of being completely Mia, which I'm very sorry about, but I couldn't help it because I was getting serious with my guy who I met through a friend almost 3 months back and who's now my boyfriend. I was also busy with my job and the defamation case against my mother. She didn't go to jail, unfortunately. I know a lot of people wanted it to happen, and it would have been great to have that slimy old woman land behind bars for what she did, but we did settle out of court for $30,000. I don't know how she and her worthless boyfriend were able to get their hands on that kind of money at all, but I'm guessing that my boyfriend and My mother's families didn't want to see their kids land up in jail, so they shelled out some money for them, but at least they're out of our lives for good now, even if they didn't end up in jail, because after what happened I highly doubt that either of them will try to mess with me or my father again, and even if they do, my new boyfriend's distantly related to a Supreme Court judge, so I'd say it wouldn't end too well for them. But all jokes aside, I honestly think we're done with them once and for all. They'd have to be really and extremely stupid to have to try and get back at us again after 2 narrow escapes, but then again I'm not sure either of them have an IQ higher than room temperature, so who knows what they might get up to next.